when it comes to any field of work, wherever you go in your career and your life and everything, you never want to go into a new place and try to revamp everything day one. You want to sit back, take it slow, learn how the processes are at that place of work that you're going into, whether that's aerospace or making donuts at Dunkin' Donuts. I don't know, what have you, right?
Welcome to It's Fine, the podcast where we take a magnifying glass to the bureaucratic bonfire that is the federal process and regulations. Brought to you by Hunter Strategy. This is the first episode in our series that's so thrilling you might just want to forget to file your poem extensions on time. Today we're slicing through the Gordian knot of government operations, focusing on the authority to operate process. It's like a Rubik's Cube, but if every color was a different regulation and the cube was occasionally on fire. The ATO process is crucial for ensuring system security and compliance, yet it's as clear as alphabet soup and often leaves cybersecurity experts scratching their heads. Enter our hero of the hour, Chris Sowards, the CEO of Watchtower Security Consultants. Chris is here to help us make sense of the ATO labyrinth, or at least find the emergency exit. With his expertise, we hope to understand why the ATO process is more confusing than one would expect. So grab your favorite stress ball and let's dive into the murky waters of federal procedure. It's going to be adventure ride filled with more twists and turns than a government forum. This is Fine, the podcast where we laugh in the face of acronyms and occasionally learn something too. Let the bureaucratic second guessing begin. So Chris, welcome. In your own words, how would you describe the ATO process to someone who's never heard of it before in a way that might actually make them laugh?
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me today, Matt. I'm excited to be here. So I relate the ATO process to buying a new car and then getting it registered every year. So when you buy a new car, your dealer tends to get it registered for you. It's normal right off the lot. Every year you have to go get it registered again with a safety check, and all your upgrades, modifications have to be checked on top of that. So with an ATO, for example, in the federal space, typically every 3 years, your IT system itself has to be ATO'd, granted authority to operate on the federal enclave itself. So with that comes a lot of inspections, safety checks, all of that stuff in a car sense. In an IT side of the house, it comes with assessing a security system, security stack, posture. Is it getting patched, plugged, everything of that nature, nuts to bolts. How a car goes, same with an IT system in the federal government for ATOs.
So one might say that the ATO process is basically the government accepting the risk of the system driving on their roads.
Absolutely. Yep. Well said.
And setting the thresholds for what that risk is. Some states make you do emissions checks. Some states do safety checks. Some states make you get your driver's license renewed more often. So that's why it's a little different depending on which agency.
100%. And with every ATO comes an authorizing official, and that's where the governance comes in, what Matt was alluding to. So every authorizing official, like any state, can allude to certain risks being on the road and not risks being on the road based on what the laws, the governance are that they're responsible for abiding by, and the mission requirement of that system for the federal agency.
So let's run with the analogy for a second. So California is known for having very strict and sometimes arbitrary feeling laws for driving or for paying your taxes or for whatever. And Michigan in general is known for being very friendly to cars, just in every way, shape, and form. So which government agency is California's DMV and which is Michigan's, in your experience?
So from my experience, and there's a lot of agencies that are like California, and I'm proud to say that is that way, just because there's a lot of sensitive information processed by the federal agencies themselves. But for the most part, the DoD on the top secret level in the intel community are the hardest to get authority to operate done. There's so many overlays, there's so many contingencies, there's so many security measures that have to be put in place when dealing with top secret, national, what can have grave disasters to our security of the state. So yeah, I would say California is the intel or DoD community.
And who's, in your experience, who's Michigan?
NIH, the National Institute of Health. And I'm not saying that to downplay NIH by any stretch and all these other agencies, but their mission focus isn't cyber, isn't intel, isn't a security of like national secrets. It's to better the well-being of the common man, society itself, or the nation state. So with that being said, NIH focuses on modern medicine, patent laws, things of that nature that really, if they get breached out into the public, it's not a grave security breach. But when you're dealing with nuclear weapons and fission technology and what have yous. You don't really want that to slip out on google.com.
So said another way, just like how Michigan has kind of decided we've got the infrastructure for roads, we're not worried about this. We've got the infrastructure for climate, we're not worried about emissions. NIH has kind of looked at it and maybe reasonably said, we're going to share all this information anyway. Its confidentiality is not our biggest concern because their mission is to share things. They might be worried about integrity and availability of their systems, but confidentiality is less of their concern. Whereas obviously in defense, confidentiality is usually the first thing you think about when you think of cybersecurity.
Absolutely. And it comes also into public opinion. So if you recall the SolarWinds breach that happened maybe 5 years ago, the DoD was under a lot of scrutiny for what happened. But other federal agencies did use SolarWinds. But you don't remember seeing NIH really in the top headlines or the VA in the top of the headlines. It was all around our military complex. So a lot of that does come down to the public eye as well. If you're slapped about the news 24/7, have to answer to 5-star generals, 4-star generals, you're definitely going to take security a lot more serious.
So what would be a good example of kind of a bizarre or crazy situation that you've had to remediate while working through an ATO? And I mean this in not in a it's got to be an egregious security violation, and don't name names if you don't have to, but something that just kind of made you learn something, something that was really strange that made you learn something new about either RMF or about government risk tolerance or about other kinds of federal mandates.
Yeah, so I'll start that off with there is government mandates across the federal spectrum. And there is an act that was passed in 2002 called FISMA that every federal agency has to abide by. The problem is it's ambiguous and everybody interprets it their own way. Just like any law, any state will interpret certain laws their own way and act upon that as such. So the hardest thing that I've come to realize in the RMF space is how fast technology adopts and how slow governance can keep up with it. As we all see, the government shut down. I think today it just got kicked down the road 2 more months. So we still don't have a budget really in place. It's the same thing at this level as well for ATOs, where cloud adoption is being adopted finally in the government space at record speed. But cloud has been around for 10, 15 years in some capacity. Everybody remembers when you had an AOL email. That was technically cloud if you think about it. But the governance of ATOs and assessments and accreditation really hasn't caught up to cloud at that level. And on top of that, assessors that are actually doing this aren't SMEs in every single technical facet. So my biggest issue that I've realized is the technology moves faster than the industry of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And that's where we tend to really have this big stopgap when it comes to ATOs across every agency. It's not just one or the other.
So one thing that's always kind of plagued me is the difference in an authorizing official or in a SCA. Really, it's the SCA because the authorizing official is rarely involved in kind of the actual validation of an individual control. We've talked about this one many times. Things that are either considered to be not applicable or things that are considered to be open based on limitations in a system. Yep. I've seen it where a place says, well, for example, we're using the community edition of Mongo, and that does not have certain logging features, certain SSL encryption features, and people use the Mongo Enterprise STIG to secure and harden and document that Mongo instance. And they say, well, we're using community, so all these enterprise controls are not applicable to us because they don't work in this product. And then on the other side, we've seen people say like, well, that doesn't mean it's not a risk. It's just you're not capable of fixing it with the product, right? That's an open risk and needs to be addressed with a mitigating control or whatever. I've seen both of those acceptable in both in DoD organizations, right? Different DoD organizations, but both within DoD organizations. How do you square that circle and how do you navigate that when you're going into a net new risk environment that you haven't worked in before?
Yeah. So when it comes to any field of work, wherever you go in your career and your life and everything, you never want to go into a new place and try to revamp everything day one. You want to sit back, take it slow, learn how the processes are at that place of work that you're going into, whether that's aerospace or making donuts at Dunkin' Donuts. I don't know, what have you, right? So when it comes to Matt's example, for instance, I take the approach of what the standard has been at the agency at first, whether it is NA or it's not it's not applicable, or if it's not compliant. But how I professionally believe it should be is it's a non-compliant control. And it doesn't mean that it's an asterisk against the system owner, whoever's developing the system. It's a asterisk against the system itself. And that should be cataloged in a risk registry somewhere, because if you have a giant exploit of something, if you have NA controls, that's not cataloged in a risk registry. So making it open, making it a finding, but not a rectifiable finding, and putting it back on the vendor itself, I think is more important, because that vendor was authorized to produce software, hardware, what have you, for the federal agency, but they're not even up to snuff for our security posture that we require. So if we keep saying it's not applicable more and more vendors of that caliber will keep skating in. And it does cost money to get stronger, beefier systems, of course. But if we're going to really take security seriously, it takes money. So that's how I look at it.
So, well, let's pick that apart a little bit, because I think that it's a reasonable thing. And I've certainly supported plenty of product environments where the government's come back and said, hey, according to this checklist, we need to do this and you're not doing it, and it's a problem for your product. At the same time, a lot of times a company can reasonably say, well, yeah, we don't log it in Mongo, just to use the example we had, but we log it in System D and we log it here instead. It's kind of created this mismatch of checklists, right? Because I've had people kind of say, well, then that makes it not applicable. Yeah. And I'm like, well, no, then that would make it compliant, right? It's just compliant using a mitigating control or a mitigating implementation versus the one that the STIG, contemplated.
Absolutely.
And a lot of places aren't set up to do that. Right. A lot of places don't understand that. And then they end up marking it not applicable based on some, EMAS or Archer or some type of system being like, well, I get it. You say you fix it over there, but you still didn't do this thing that this STIG said. So this is still not compliant. But if I keep it as not compliant, you're going to say, well, I'm never going to fix it because I did it a different way. So how do you square that particular circle? Is it left open forever as a risk acceptance? Like, what should agencies do, and where do you think that they go wrong when that you have a system that might be reasonably designed to be secure, but not in the way that the individual component STIGs contemplated their component security?
100%. And there's 100 ways to skin a cat. And when it comes to computers, there's 1,000 ways to secure a computer. And the problem is when it comes to the federal government, they are very ambiguous, and then sometimes they're very straight to the point. And when it comes to GRC, with technology expanding, there's new technologies to answer 100 different security related measures that you might have it or need for. And if the security control assessor is coming in there and you're trying to explain to them, this is how I'm doing it, this is how it works, this is how it should be, and everything like that, sometimes it's hard because it's always been done this way, I've never seen it done that way. It becomes a challenge. And every assessment with every mature assessor I've ever gone through has been a battle for weeks on weeks on weeks. And my biggest success that I've seen, at least, is one, always be honest. You always be upright and forward about, I'm going to fail these. This is just an issue we currently have. Because assessors, they know developers, the system owners know their system better than they will ever know it. They just do. And most assessors aren't as tech savvy as the architects, the engineers, the coders, what have you as well. So sometimes they don't even know to ask the right questions. So I've realized that it's a lot easier to teach the assessors how your system works, what you're doing, and to show you truly care about security. Because more than 9 times out of 10, all the assessors that have been in this industry for 10 plus years have had a system that's been breached, hacked, something that they put their stamp of approval on. Whether they got burned or something else happened, every story is different. But the trust between the assessor and the system owner is empirical to be able to get through the challenges Matt was alluding to.
What advice would you give to either a new company or a new product that's getting sold to the government for the first time, and they're going through this process and they're told you need to get an IATT or you need to get an ATO in order for us to use you. What do you tell them? They come to you and they say, all right, how do I do this? What's going on here? What do I have to do? Where do you start?
So my advice first would be email matt@hunterstrategy.net. 100% outsource this problem. You want to outsource this problem. I'm just going to let you know that you're going to have staff that ends up hating you, that are doing things that just don't make sense because the federal government sometimes just doesn't make sense unless you're in the federal government. Then the commercial sector doesn't make any sense because it moves too fast and we get scared sometimes. So all seriousness, if you're starting from scratch, I would shop around 3POs, third-party assessors that are approved to support the federal agency, and try to garner as much information as possible. A lot of companies are just trying to sell you, and they're putting out information that's not factual and trying to scare you into you really need them, but they really don't know what they're doing, or they're going to fluff the numbers in order to bill you at a higher rate. If you ever do go to a 3PO, have them show you past performances of getting people accredited, balance that out between some of their competitors as well to see who's who in the zoo, maybe talk to some friends in the same industry that have had to go through the same process. But so all that aside, you're going through this process. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know where to start and everything. NIST 853 is the end all be all, has all the controls, everything you need to be able to be hunky dory in the federal government's eyes. There's other frameworks like NIST 800, 171, 160, 182, what have yous, right? But I recommend everyone NIST 853 is the breadbasket of the federal government for security. Document everything. That's the one thing I can tell you. Create procedures, create policies, create invoices, records management, everything you need governance. And every governance is not governance without paper bagging it. So that's my advice. And then call Matt.
So I guess, and certainly I agree when you're bringing in third-party assessor and you're talking about cloud, everything you said's very accurate. Say you're installing something on-prem and you're following more of a traditional ATO process, but your software product is being included in the stack, right? What do you tell companies that are kind of, less, maybe they still need a third party. They just need a third party to help them set up their software or to help them fill it. Because what do you tell a company that has fantastic dashboarding tools that people want to put on-prem to deal with sensitive databases that you don't keep in the cloud, but then they're told, hey, you got to ATO this product in order for us to use it?
Yeah, so you definitely need to follow a framework. It's NIST 800-161. It's for CSCRM, so supply chain risk management. If you're a vendor, you need to be also kind of accredited at 800-171, which can be self-accredited, because when selling things to the federal government wants to know, one, are you good to go in the federal space? Are you like nation backed and everything? Are you not like partnered with China, Iran, Russia, one of our enemies and everything like that? They want to check that out. They want to see who you're hiring, how you're training individuals, etc. Then they also want to see how you're coding and developing your product itself. They want to see how that product works. And if you're outsourcing your code overseas, that's a flag. There's a thing called ITAR, and forgive me, I'd actually need to look up the acronym unless, Matt, you know what ITAR stands for on top of your head. Yeah, International Trafficking and Arms Regulations. So sure, that has something to do with the munitions and everything, but in relation to ATOs and cybersecurity, in regards to ITAR, it has to do with information traveling overseas. Sure, I can email someone in Germany, but technically that is trafficking information. So they want to make sure that you're abiding by ITAR regulations as well. So there's a lot of frameworks and there's a lot going on in GRC to be able to sell to the government. I do want to say one thing though. If you're installing software on a cloud-based server, that is technically on-prem, even though it's in the cloud. It's a very ambiguous, confusing thing. I'm sure that's a conversation Matt wants to have, maybe argue about, but
No. You're correct about that. It's a thing that happens a lot in agencies. People, this is more of a DoD concept of the impact levels, right? But I've had people say like, they name some on-prem software package and they're like, is it IL4 or IL5? And I'm like, it's neither. It's software. It's like running in an IL5 cloud, maybe, but like that's just not that software doesn't have its own impact level because it's not a cloud service offering, and impact levels are cloud service offering concepts. And so, yeah, that's something I have to explain to people a lot. And then people are saying, well, can't I just spin this up in a FedRAMP approved or IL4 or IL5 approved cloud and install the software in there? And I'm like, you can, but that doesn't obviate your need for an ATO for that system, right? And that's even something I've seen in certain, even within DoD, in certain agencies, they take the mission owner ATO for cloud systems very seriously, and you got to do a full ATO package. I've seen other places say, ooh, it has a FedRAMP, and wave a magic wand and just start using it. Now, I give some nuance to that, right? Because when you're talking about DocuSign, there's not much to configure. Like, yeah, you should probably like wave a magic wand and call it fine. I don't know. There's probably like maybe there should be like a small checklist of like certain hardening steps. I don't think it's nothing, but it's not like, do I really need an ATO and a full SSP to use DocuSign, which is fully FedRAMP approved and a very turnkey, very easy to configure application? And that's like one extreme. Then you have things like ServiceNow and Salesforce and Appian that are like pretty strong development platforms that you can do a lot of both good things with, but also like leave a lot of security gaps in if they're not done right. So there's got to be something that, again, that doesn't feel like it should need a full ATO to me, but it also doesn't feel like it's a nothing, DocuSign, which only has like probably 50 buttons in the whole interface, right? So like there's a spectrum there, and it seems to be a big gap, right? It seems to be a big gap in agencies' understandings of how they can use FedRAMP.
Yeah. So Matt, you bring up a good point, and it goes back to kind of how we opened, is that assessors can't keep up with what's going on in the tech space. And when it comes to cloud-based systems, there's an organization called FedRAMP, a Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. And they actually are the governance body to authorize cloud-based vendors to be approved to supply to the federal government. So they'll go in and they'll assess these vendors' software, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, what have yous, right? And they'll go in there and then give you a check in the box. In that FedRAMP package is a customer responsibility matrix. So it says, FedRAMP says they're good to go, but the customer, aka the agency, has to abide by XYZ in order for this to be a complete FedRAMP authorization. And some agencies don't understand that. Some agencies don't have the resources to be able to do that. And some agencies are just so by the old school book. They're like, we're still doing a full ATO. If you know anything about DocuSign, you can't really do much. So it's really difficult.
And by the way, that's not an indictment on the system. That's a feature. It's a very simple thing that does what it does well and simply, and it's not a lot of knobs or levers to turn, but it does make the process of implementing 300 security control documentation for it feeling a bit ridiculous, frankly.
100%. So let's sticking on the SharePoint or the Salesforce example. So at NIH, I actually worked with a system called TaskRay. Not going to get into what TaskRay supplies or anything like that, but they're an independent software vendor built natively on the Salesforce platform. Same with DocuSign. Now, for TaskRay, it's on Salesforce. It's advertised. DocuSign, on the other hand, they want to be their own body, their entity, right? So when trying to get TaskRay accredited, think of it just like DocuSign. There's not much you can configure in a security stack. So Salesforce, from a legal perspective, in fine lining states, we're trusting the vendor that they are abiding by our regulations building on our government cloud, but they're pushing off the legal matter of that on their end. Now you go to Salesforce. Now Salesforce says we're trusting AWS, because if you know that the independent software vendors are on Salesforce, Salesforce is on AWS. So who do you trust? And does it really realistic for a minor application like TaskRay or DocuSign for you to accredit AWS, Salesforce, and DocuSign? I mean, an ATO already can sit at 6 months sometimes. That's sometimes the best case. If you're doing 3 cloud platforms, as big as AWS, as big as Salesforce, following their customer responsibility matrix, you might as well just quit. Like that, you're not in a good place. Like go somewhere else, because that is not a fight you can win. you'll never keep up. And as fast as people are migrating to cloud and doing this, that's something in this industry that has to change, is looking at things with such a fine-tooth comb that don't actually exist, or we already have transitive trust to accept the risk from other federal agencies. So I think the federal agencies should communicate a lot better. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So in closing, Chris, since we've probably gone through a lot of the hour here. So Chris, we talked a little bit about the, on-prem software running in the cloud. One of my favorite examples of software that people use all the time in a cloud basis, but can be incredibly auspicious for government agencies use or CUI, is the Atlassian suite. They are famously a little behind on their commitments to the community to be FedRAMP accredited. They know they've got great customers waiting for them on the government side once it's available. They sent a letter about a year ago, if I remember correctly, just like apologizing and like extending some pricing for on-prem things. So how do you deal with things when companies sometimes are just struggling to get to their FedRAMP?
Yeah, and that's fair, because FedRAMP packages, one, it can cost you $500,000 if you're a vendor trying to get something FedRAMP accredited, from a 3PO to an assessment. Just from time, it could take so long as well. Somebody like Atlassian and everything, they are trying really hard, but they're also a company that is based out of, I believe, Australia, but it's not based in the CONUS states, right? So they come with their own challenges for ITAR and everything. Now, they're a trusted vendor with the government and everything, so they are going to receive their FedRAMP. But to answer Matt's question, I had a customer at one of the agencies that had Jira being utilized in the cloud, but it wasn't FedRAMP accredited. And technically, the authorizing officials of that agency can approve or deny any cloud-based system that does not have a FedRAMP accreditation. With that, this agency decided, nope, we don't want that. Go figure out a different solution. This system owner did not have a server to deploy Jira on premise. So we came up with a solution, seeing as they were already using AWS's infrastructure for some of their other work, to turn on one of their old EC2 instances that they've just been paying for that they forgot about, to be honest with you. I'm not going to say who this system owner is per se and throw anyone under the bus, but yes. So we decided to use that server, spin it up, and install Jira on that EC2 instance. Now, from a rudimentary perspective and from a lot of assessors who look at that, that's cloud-based Jira. It is absolutely not. It's on-premise, on a server, just in the AWS infrastructure. And that AWS infrastructure is FedRAMP, so you can treat that as if it's on-prem through transitive trust with the FedRAMP compliance package. So,
yeah, it's. I guess we'll have to see, because I'm pretty sure if you look through the FedRAMP documentation, they're only able to assess something like 20 systems a year, and there's roughly 20,000 SaaS applications available to the commercial market today. Not that necessarily all of them are government is interested in or anything like that, but it just, even if it was half or even if it was 10%, we'll have them assessed at current FedRAMP funding levels by 2050. And it's not like a lot of new SaaS platforms are coming out or anything, so that shouldn't be a problem for catching up with the backlog.
Exactly. And there's so many limited 3POs that FedRAMP is authorized to speak on their behalf as well and go assess these systems. So one of the things, at least I've seen happen, I don't know how this exactly works. Coalfire is one of the biggest 3POs and everything. I've never had an issue with Coalfire. This isn't a plug for them by any stretch. I have no stake in them. But one of the things is, one, getting Coalfire on your side, or finding an agency that has a need for your software, your system, your cloud platform itself. Because if the agency has a driving mission, FedRAMP is going to expedite that assessment higher than vendors who just want to be on the FedRAMP marketplace. They just want to be advertised that, hey, you can buy our stuff. If there's a need on the government side, you're going to have a quicker FedRAMP turnaround than if there's not a need and you just want to be on Kelley Blue Book selling cars. I'm going back to the car example because I know we're wrapping up, so I like to start or end where I started. So Matt, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And so with that, I think we had a really great conversation here, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on. Look forward to more in our continued series around different aspects of government security and authorization and how we can help make some improvements. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everybody.